Hello again. It's me, El Pesadito. Okay, so now we're going to move on to James Baldwin, and very interesting writer. Um, I was thinking about actually putting another country as a text, and then I decided, well, there's not enough time, but you know, just think about it as reading material at some stage in your life. I think you'll find it very, very interesting. So I'm just going to start off with a quote that I found from Baldwin, and in a way it sums up that kind of the anger that you can feel sometimes from African Americans. And it's something that, I don't know if any of you are like rap music, but you find that kind of energy from certain rap artists. And as from my last presentation, and if you start looking a bit deeper into the topic, you can start understanding where this is coming from. This dark energy. It's quite, yeah, it's very forceful. But anyway, I'm just going to read it out. So he says, and there is no Negro living in America who has not felt briefly and for long periods with anguish sharp or dull, simple, naked, and unanswerable hatred, who has not wanted to smash any white face he may encounter in a day. Now, obviously, that's one. So you might think that this is a guy who's just got a chip on his shoulder, and he's not. But it's obviously Baldwin is when you read Baldwin, he's much more nuanced than that. So when you read Another Country, there is a character called Rufus who feels like that. He feels, because obviously he's been psychologically battered. His people are have been physically beaten down. So they feel that pain, and it's an ancestral kind of pain. And even if you look at trauma studies, when you look into trauma studies, they talk about how trauma can be inherited down through the generations. And there is some sort of traumatic experience in the African American experience, and that has been, without a doubt, transmitted through the generations. And so that's, you have to know where it's coming from. So Another Country, on the other hand, is, as I said, much more balanced. And there is a character I'll be talking about a little bit later, but I'll just, now that it's popped up on my mind, I might as well say it, who's called Vivaldo Moore, who is half Irish, half Italian, and he's a white character in Another Country. And Vivaldo Moore falls in love with an African American. He himself is struggling to become an artist, a writer. He himself he's working class. So in a sense, Baldwin does recognize, obviously, that white people also suffer. So it's not Mankian. It's not like black and white when he's writing. There is another Baldwin, obviously, who's very politicized, and that Baldwin sometimes can feel a bit sort of like in that kind of very confrontational, but he does recognize the other. But I'm going to read a quote from Colin Tobin, who wrote the introduction to I don't know if it was the last edition of Another Country. And I think it's interesting because it says, and this is what Tobin says, he says, Baldwin began to muse about how little essential differences there was between the races in the United States, and this idea that the other characters in Another Country, the white people, suffer too, and are confused, and that their suffering and confusion mirrors the suffering and the confusion of Rufus. Rufus is one of the main characters in the book, and well, this is a bit of a spoiler, but he commits suicide. But even though that's kind of earlier on in the text. So, to move on, I'm just going to give you just a brief introduction into, well, you can see it here on the slide, so I won't go into it in too much detail. Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is written in 1953. Okay, so Go Tell It on the Mountain is like a semi-autobiographical Bildungsroman. So the rhythms of Go Tell It on the Mountain is actually, it's a gospel song, but it also has echoes of the King James Bible. And as I said, like traditionally African Americans were very spiritual, and there was a lot of Bible reading. So a lot of the actual language that they use has biblical tones to it. In the case of Go Tell on the Mountain, the story of Noah's son Ham, and even the actual language itself has kind of a biblical kind of undertone. And it's the King James Bible, by the way, because the King James Bible was the Protestant Bible, and it was one that was not annotated. It was written in a more direct. It was not mediated through any kind of ideology. Supposedly, it was supposed to be more closer to the more original texts. So, the next text. His next novel was Notes of a Native Son, which is written in 1955. And he talks about segregation in the US, and also talks about his times growing up as a young boy with a paranoid stepfather. Okay, and also it talks about, because Baldwin himself became a preacher very soon, and in the Pentecostal church. Okay, the Pentecostals are very like very spiritual, kind of otherworldly phenomenon. So Baldwin was, when you see You Are Not My Negro, and there's a lot of footage of Baldwin, you will find that he's very forceful in the way he speaks. He's very clear. And if you think of one of the other great African American leaders, Martin Luther King, also he was a preacher, or even Malcolm X, he wasn't but certainly he had that kind of maybe it comes from the African oral tradition, I don't know, but certainly that mix of the African oral tradition with that very kind of like preacherly biblical thing gives it a very much a sort of a special kind of impact. So in Notes of a Native Son, his stepfather is a preacher, but very soon he finds himself being overshadowed by his own stepson. In this case, it's basically the stand-in for Baldwin. But Baldwin very soon becomes very, very disillusioned with the church, and he leaves it. But it still stays with him, obviously. Giovanni's Room. You also have to remember that Baldwin was a homosexual. So even here we have quite an interesting. So we have the confluence of gender with, if you like, race or ethnic. So in a sense, if you think about the United States that he's growing up in, it's homophobic, and it's also racist. So if you like, he's doubly kind of battered down by these two things. So he himself moves to Paris in the 1950s to kind of escape the claustrophobia of the United States. And Giovanni's Room is inspired by his times in Paris. And it's the story of an African American who takes an Italian lover, and they go to live in this room, which is over. I think it's over. If I remember rightly, it's over a bar, and so it has a very interesting mix of themes, because it talks about social isolation, it talks about gender, sexual identities, and then of course the crisis of masculinities. So as you can see, as in another country, Giovanni's room looks at cross-racial relationships, sexual relationships, and the difficulties of those. I think that's the interesting thing. If you like, the sometimes how they can be incommensurably different, but not in an essential way, but how they become somehow, how people have to negotiate these differences, and how sometimes we can't. The tragedy of that. Okay. So another country which I'm talking about, obviously there is, as I talked about Vivaldo Moore and his relationship with Ida. Okay. And it's kind of, in a way, it's like a microcosm of the relationship between white American liberals and African Americans, because obviously not all Americans were or are racist. So it's both the conversation that's going on, not just between African Americans, but also that conversation that's going on between them and the white population. Which, when you think about it, if you look back to the first part of our course, there were similar things happening as well. When we looked at East as East, well, it was the same thing was happening again. So that's the whole multiculturalism. Even though, could we call African Americans, could we frame that within multicultural society? Well, I actually think that it's what we understand as multiculturalism, in a sense, is happening there. That is the first modern, if you like, multicultural experience, the experience of the African American. So we have Rufus, who's the jazz musician, but he's suffering from this internalization of like structural racism, and this creates in him this kind of self-hate. So he's something that's he doesn't always voice it, but we always feel it in him, and it's what drives him to his own demise. That's the tragic element within another country, and it's and that's why it's so important. So that's why all these cultural expressions that we see, all these things like Between the World and Me, which I said was a letter that Ta-Nehisi Coates writes to his son. It's this idea of not falling into this self-hatred, because you can internalize so much these things until you don't know what's a part of society and what is actually is happening inside your own head. Okay. On the next slide, when we look to Rufus Scott, Baldwin, and I quote from here, he says, he calls Rufus Scott the black corpse floating in the national psyche. Okay, and also he also likens him to a kind of like a Christ figure in the sense that he becomes symbolic of the suffering of all black men. Okay. But then that's one of the themes, but also there's lots of sub-themes within the book. There's the whole theme of sexuality. For example, Vivaldo Moore himself has this kind of homoerotic relationship with Rufus. Is he not recognizing his own bisexuality? Also the fact that he's also, that's him, and then also the relationship between Vivaldo and Ida. So there are many other kind of sub-themes as well. So I think obviously from an aesthetic perspective, in another country is interesting because it's it's first and foremost an artistic piece of work. So in all art, ambiguity is one of the essential elements. It's not like some kind of pamphlet. So it's a way. It's an access for certainly for people like for us who haven't. It's a way of who have no direct experience with this. It's a way of imagining how it feels from their perspective. So that makes it quite interesting. Okay, guys, that's it. I hope this brief video helps you just to situate yourselves a little bit more. You'll be looking at Terence Hayes' poems, which won the National Book Award. I think it was 2 years ago. And hopefully this will help you to situate both with that. Then we'll be watching the film. For those of you who are working on the African American project on the presentation, it'll kind of help a little bit. And then, of course, for your reading of Ta-Nehisi Coates. Okay, guys, be safe. Cuidadito con las compras. Y por favor, que no se os pegue el bicho. Adiós.